Hello everyone, welcome back. I know many of you listen while falling asleep, so before you drift off tonight, do me a small favor. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. It always amazes me how many different corners of the world tune into these stories. And if you haven't already, hit that like button and subscribe. It really does help more than you know. Now, let's get comfortable, settle in, pull that blanket up a little closer. Let the world outside fade away for a while. Tonight's case is one that has haunted the state of Texas for over 4 decades. It is not the story of a single murder. It is not the story of one killer. It is the story of a stretch of land barely 25 miles long that has swallowed young women whole and never given them back. Not fully. Not in any way that makes sense. Some of their bodies were found in shallow graves, half hidden in marshland. Others were discovered in open fields, left like discarded things. And some, to this day, have never been found at all. Their families still wait. Their mothers still dream about them. Their fathers still drive past that stretch of highway and feel something cold settle in their chests. This is the story of the Texas killing fields. To understand what happened, you have to understand the place. And to understand the place, you have to drive it yourself, at least in your mind. Picture this, you are on Interstate 45, the highway that connects Houston to Galveston, two of the largest cities in southeastern Texas. Houston, a sprawling metropolis of millions, sits to the north. A coastal city with salt air and crumbling Victorian homes in the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico, sits to the south. Between them, the highway stretches for about 50 miles, cutting through an area that most people would never think twice about. It is flat, endless almost. The land on either side of the highway is dotted with oil refineries, chemical plants, strip malls, fast food restaurants, and wide stretches of nothing. Marshland, overgrown fields, patches of thick, tangled brush where the ground is soft and wet and the mosquitoes swarm in clouds so thick they look like smoke. This is the Gulf Coast of Texas. The humidity is relentless. The heat, for most of the year, presses down on you like a physical weight. The air smells of salt and sulfur and gasoline. The sky on cloudy days is a flat, featureless gray that seems to stretch on forever, blending into the land at the horizon so that you cannot tell where one ends and the other begins. Along this corridor, in the cities and towns that line Interstate 45, League City, Texas City, Dickinson, Lamarck, Santa Fe, Hitchcock, young women began disappearing in the early 1970s. At first, no one connected the cases. The towns were small, the police departments were underfunded, and the victims were often from working-class families, young women who hitchhiked or walked alone or worked late, night shifts at convenience stores and diners. They were the kind of people who, in those days, in that part of the country, could vanish without the world noticing. A missing poster on a telephone pole, a brief mention in the local newspaper. A mother calling the police station every week, asking if there was any news, and being told every week that there was not, but the bodies kept appearing. One by one, year after year, they surfaced. In ditches, in fields, along the edges of back roads, in patches of brush so dense that it took search dogs to find them. And the pattern, if you could call it that, was always the same young women, usually between the ages of 12 and 25. Usually last seen somewhere along or near Interstate 45. Usually found weeks or months or years after they vanished. Their remains so decomposed that identification was difficult, sometimes impossible. And almost always the cases went unsolved. By the time investigators began to suspect that something larger was happening, that this was not simply a series of unrelated tragedies, but something darker, something deliberate, the body count had already climbed into the dozens. And the stretch of land where so many of them were found, a desolate marshy area just off the highway near League City, had earned a name that would become infamous: the Killing Fields. The name sounds like something from a horror movie, but there is nothing fictional about it. The Killing Fields is a real place. You can drive to it today. You can stand in the tall grass and look out across the flat, empty land and hear nothing but the wind and the distant hum of traffic on the highway. It does not look like a place where evil lives. It looks like nothing, and maybe that is the point. Maybe that is what made it so perfect for the people who used it as a dumping ground for their victims. It was close enough to the highway to be convenient, but remote enough that no one would see you. No one would hear a scream. No one would notice a car pulled over on the shoulder in the middle of the night. And by morning, the tall grass and the standing water and the thick, humid air would begin the slow work of erasing whatever had been left behind. The story of the Texas killing fields does not have a single beginning. It does not have a single villain. It does not have a clean, satisfying ending where the killer is caught and the families get their answers and justice is served. Instead, it is a tangled, sprawling, deeply disturbing story that stretches across decades and involves multiple suspects, multiple victims, and multiple law enforcement agencies that often worked at cross purposes, jealously guarding their own cases and their own leads while the bodies continued to pile up. But every story has to start somewhere. And for the Texas killing fields, the story begins, as it so often does in cases like this, with a girl who simply did not come home. Her name was Colette Wilkerson Wilson. She was 13 years old. She had dark hair and a bright, open face and the kind of easy smile that made people like her immediately. She was a student at Nolan Ryan Junior High School in Alvin, Texas, a small city about 30 miles south of Houston. Alvin was the kind of town where everybody knew everybody, where kids rode their bikes to school and parents left their doors unlocked at night. And the biggest excitement of the year was the county fair. It was safe, or at least it felt safe. And in 1971, when Colette Wilson was 13, the idea that something terrible could happen to a child walking home from school in broad daylight was almost unthinkable. Colette was a good student. She was quiet but not shy, the kind of girl who listened carefully in class and always did her homework and had a small, close circle of friends who adored her. She liked music. She liked animals. She was close to her mother, who worked hard to give Colette and her siblings a stable, loving home. There was nothing remarkable about Colette's life. And I do not mean that as an insult. I mean it as a statement of how ordinary and precious her world was. She was a 13-year-old girl living a 13-year-old girl's life, worrying about homework and friendships and what she was going to wear to school the next day. She had her whole future ahead of her. She had dreams, the way all 13-year-olds have dreams, vague and shimmering and full of possibility. She did not know yet what she wanted to be when she grew up, but that was fine. Or at least she should have had time. On June 17, 1971, Colette left her school in the afternoon, walking toward the spot where her mother usually picked her up. It was a Thursday. The weather was hot, the way it always is in southeast Texas in the summer, and the air was thick with humidity. Colette was carrying her books. She was wearing a light-colored blouse and a skirt. She walked along the road, following the same route she always followed, passing the same houses and the same yards and the same parked cars she passed every day. And then she was gone. No one saw what happened. No one heard a scream or a struggle. One moment, Colette Wilson was walking along the road in the afternoon sun, a 13-year-old girl on her way to meet her mother. The next moment, she had vanished. Her mother arrived at the pickup spot and waited, and waited. And when Colette did not appear, she drove the route daughter would have walked, looking for her, expecting to see her around every corner. But there was no sign of her, no sign of her books, no sign of a struggle, nothing. The police were called. A search was organized. Neighbors and volunteers combed the area, calling Colette's name, looking in ditches and fields and behind buildings. The hours passed. Night fell, and Colette Wilson did not come home. The days that followed were a nightmare for Colette's family. The police investigated, but there was almost nothing to go on. No witnesses, no physical evidence, no ransom note, no phone call. It was as if the earth had simply opened up and swallowed her. The local newspaper ran a story. Flyers were printed and distributed. People in Alvin talked about it in hushed tones, the way people in small towns talk about things that frighten them, not quite believing it could happen here, not quite able to accept that a child could disappear in the middle of the day in their quiet, safe little town. Weeks passed, then months, and then in November of that same year, nearly 5 months after Colette vanished, her remains were found. They were discovered in a field near Addicks Reservoir, an area northwest of Houston, miles from where she had last been seen. Her body had been left in the open, exposed to the elements and to the wildlife and to the slow, merciless process of decomposition. The condition of her remains made it difficult to determine exactly how she had died, but the circumstances left no doubt that she had been murdered. Colette Wilson was 13 years old. She had been walking home from school, and someone had taken her, killed her, and dumped her body in a field like she was nothing, like she was garbage. The investigation into Colette's murder went nowhere. The police had no suspects, no leads, and no forensic evidence that could point them in any direction. In 1971, the tools that modern investigators take for granted, DNA analysis, cell phone records, surveillance cameras, digital forensics, simply did not exist. All the police had were interviews, shoe leather, and hope. And hope, in a case like this, was not enough. Colette Wilson's murder was devastating, but it was also, in a terrible way, just the beginning. Because in the years that followed, more young women would disappear along the Interstate 45 corridor, and more bodies would be found. And the pattern that would eventually become known as the Texas Killing Fields would slowly, horribly begin to take shape. But before we move forward in time, I want to stay with Colette for a moment longer. Because it is easy in a case like this, where the body count is high and the timeline and the details are overwhelming, to lose sight of the individual, to start thinking of the victims as numbers, as names on a list, as data points in a pattern, and I refuse to do that. Every single one of these women and girls was a person. A real, breathing, living person with a name and a face and a family and a future that was stolen from them. And Colette Wilson, the girl who vanished on a hot Thursday afternoon in June, was the first. Or at least she was the first that we know of. The first whose disappearance and death can be clearly linked to the corridor of violence that would come to define this stretch of Texas highway. Her mother never stopped looking for answers. For years, decades, she kept Colette's memory alive, kept pushing the police, kept hoping that someday someone would come forward with information. She aged, she grew frail. And still, no one was ever charged with Colette's murder. The case went cold, the way so many of these cases would go cold, filed away in a cabinet in a police station, gathering dust, waiting for a break that never came. Now let us move forward, because the killing did not stop with Colette. It was only beginning. In 1973, 2 years after Colette's disappearance, 2 more girls vanished. Their names were Brenda Jones and Georgia Geer. Brenda was 14. Georgia was also 14. They were friends, and they lived in Galveston, the island city at the southern end of Interstate 45. On July 1, 1973, the 2 girls left Brenda's house to go to a nearby convenience store. It was a short walk, just a few blocks. The kind of errand that 14-year-old girls in Galveston ran every day without a second thought. They were going to buy snacks. They told Brenda's mother they would be right back. They never came back. Like Colette Wilson before them, Brenda and Georgia vanished completely. No witnesses, no evidence, no trace. One moment they were 2 teenage girls walking to a store on a summer afternoon, and the next moment they were gone. The police searched. The families pleaded. The community rallied. And none of it mattered. Brenda Jones and Georgia Geer had been swallowed by the same void that had taken Colette Wilson. Their remains were found months later in separate locations, both in areas along the Interstate 45 corridor. The condition of their bodies, like Colette's, made it difficult to determine the exact cause of death. But again, the circumstances left no room for doubt. These girls had been taken, murdered, and discarded, and still no one was caught. No one was charged. No one was held accountable. I want you to think about that for a moment. 3 girls, all between the ages of 13 and 14, all taken from public places in broad daylight, all found dead in remote areas along the same stretch of highway. And the police had nothing, no suspect, no motive, no physical evidence linking any person to any of the crimes. It was as if a ghost were moving along Interstate 45, picking off young women at random, and vanishing back into the heat haze. But it was not a ghost. It was a person, or persons. And the fact that they were never caught, that they were able to operate with what seemed like complete impunity, is one of the most disturbing aspects of this entire story. The mid-1970s brought more disappearances, more bodies, more grief. The names accumulated like a terrible litany. Kimberly Pitchford, Gloria Gonzalez, Debbie Ackerman, and Maria Johnson, each name a life. Each life a story that ended in violence and sorrow. Let me tell you about Debbie and Maria, because their case is one of the most haunting in the entire Killing Fields saga. Rhonda Renee Johnson, who went by Maria, was 15. Debbie Ackerman was also 15. They were best friends, the way teenage girls are best friends, inseparable, sharing secrets and dreams in the small daily dramas of adolescence. They lived in Galveston County, and on November 15, 1971, the same year Colette Wilson was killed, they were hitchhiking along the highway, trying to get to a nearby town. Hitchhiking, in 1971, was common. It was not considered particularly dangerous, especially for young people in small towns and rural areas. Everybody did it. It was how you got around if you did not have a car and your parents were at work and there was no bus. You stuck out your thumb and waited for a friendly neighbor or a passing truck driver to pull over and offer you a ride. It was informal, casual, woven into the fabric of everyday life. And most of the time it was perfectly safe, but not always. And not for Debbie Ackerman and Maria Johnson. Someone picked did not know, or perhaps someone they did know. There is no way to be certain. And whoever that someone was, they did not take the girls where they wanted to go. Instead, the girls ended up dead. Their bodies were found 3 days later, on November 18th in Turner Bayou, a waterway in Galveston County. They had been shot, both of them. Debbie had been shot in the head. Maria had been shot twice. They were 15 years old. The investigation into their murders focused quickly on a suspect, a local police officer named Gerald Burr. Burr was a member of the League City Police Department, and there was circumstantial evidence linking him to the girls. Witnesses reported seeing a vehicle matching Burr's patrol car in the area where the girls were last seen. There were other pieces of evidence, too, fragments and threads that seemed to point in his direction. But the case against Burr was never strong enough to bring to trial. He was never formally charged with the murders of Debbie Ackerman and Maria Johnson. He denied any involvement, and eventually the investigation stalled. Gerald Burr would remain a person of interest in the case for years. His name would come up again and again as investigators looked at the broader pattern of disappearances and murders along the Interstate 45 corridor. But he was never convicted of any crime related to the Killing Fields. He died in 2002, taking whatever secrets he had with him. The case of Debbie Ackerman and Maria Johnson is significant for several reasons. First, it is one of the earliest cases that investigators would later link to the broader pattern of violence along Interstate 45. Second, it introduced a deeply troubling element into the story, the possibility that a law enforcement officer, someone sworn to protect and serve, might be involved in the killings. This was not the last time that suspicion would fall on someone in a position of authority. And third, it demonstrated, with brutal clarity, the vulnerability of the victims. These were not wealthy, well-connected people with resources and influence. They were working-class girls, many of them from broken homes, many of them living on the margins, many of them doing things that put them at risk. Hitchhiking, walking alone at night, working late shifts in isolated locations, not because they were reckless, but because they had no other choice. They were poor, they were young, and in the eyes of the world they were disposable. That is a hard thing to say. But it is true, and it is one of the reasons why the Texas Killing Fields case dragged on for so long without resolution. The victims were not the kind of people whose disappearances made national headlines. They were not the daughters of senators or celebrities or corporate executives. They were the daughters of waitresses and construction workers, and single mothers who worked 2 jobs and still could not make ends meet. They were the kind of people who fell through the cracks, whose cases were assigned to overworked detectives in underfunded police departments, whose files ended up at the bottom of the pile, and the killer, or killers, knew this. They knew that these were safe targets. They knew that a missing teenage girl from a working-class family in Galveston County would not generate the same level of urgency and attention as a missing girl from River Oaks or Memorial. They knew that the police would investigate, yes, but that the investigation would be limited by resources and manpower and competing priorities. They knew that the media would run a story, maybe two, and then move on. They knew that the world would forget, and for the most part they were right. But not entirely. Because there were people who did not forget. There were mothers and fathers who never stopped searching. There were detectives who never stopped investigating, even when their departments told them to move on, even when the cases went cold, even when the leads dried up and the evidence degraded, and the years turned into decades. There were journalists who kept writing about the cases, kept asking uncomfortable questions, kept shining a light into the dark corners where the truth was hiding. And there were ordinary citizens, neighbors and friends and community members, who kept the memories of the victims alive, who refused to let them be reduced to statistics. The story of the Texas killing fields is, in many ways, a story about persistence. The persistence of evil, yes, but also the persistence of love, and of grief, and of the stubborn, defiant refusal to accept that some crimes are simply unsolvable. As the 1970s gave way to the 1980s, the disappearances continued, and the geographic center of the horror began to crystallize around a specific area, the stretch of highway and the surrounding communities near League City, Texas. League City, in those days, was a small, quiet town of maybe 20 or 30,000 people, sandwiched between Houston and Galveston. It was the kind of place where people moved to escape the crime and chaos of the big city. A bedroom community of modest homes and tidy lawns and good schools. It was safe. Everybody said so. The crime rate was low, the neighbors were friendly. The churches were full on Sundays. But there was something about the land around League City, the open fields and the marshy lowlands and the isolated stretches of road, that seemed to attract darkness. Maybe it was the remoteness. Maybe it was the proximity to the highway, which provided easy access and easy escape. Maybe it was something else entirely, something that cannot be explained by geography or logistics. Something that has to do with the way certain places seem to accumulate suffering, as if the ground itself has a memory, as if the earth azorlance is done upon it, and holds it there, like a stain that will not wash out. Whatever the reason, it was near League City that the most infamous cluster of murders in the Killing Fields saga would occur. And it was near League City that the case would finally, after decades of frustration and failure, begin to yield its secrets. But that is getting ahead of the story. For now, let me tell you about the Calder Road field. Calder Road is a narrow, two-lane road that runs through an undeveloped area south of League City. On either side of the road there are open fields, some of them used for cattle grazing, some of them simply overgrown with tall grass and weeds and scrubby bushes. The terrain is flat and marshy, prone to flooding during heavy rains, and thick with mosquitoes and snakes during the warmer months. It is not a place where people go voluntarily. There are no houses, no businesses, no reason for anyone to be there unless they are looking for something specific, or unless they are trying to hide something. In February of 1984, an employee of a local oil company was walking through one of the fields near Calder Road when he stumbled upon something in the tall grass. At first he thought it was an animal carcass, a deer, perhaps, or a coyote. But as he got closer, he realized that what he was looking at was not an animal. It was a human skeleton. The police were called. The area was cordoned off, and as investigators began to process the scene, they made a grim discovery. There was not one body in the field. There were two. The first set of remains was identified as Hyde Villarreal Fye. Hyde was 23 years old. She had last been seen alive on October 10, 1983, approximately 4 months before her body was found. She had been living in League City at the time of her disappearance, and she had a troubled history. She had struggled with substance abuse and had been involved in relationships that were unstable and sometimes dangerous. She was the kind of person who, in the cold language of law enforcement, was classified as high risk. The kind of person whose disappearance did not immediately set off alarm bells. The kind of person who might have simply moved on, left town, started over somewhere else. But Hyde Villarreal Fye had not moved on. She had been murdered and left in a field off Calder Road, her body exposed to the elements, slowly disappearing into the landscape. The second set of remains found near Hade's body could not be immediately identified. The bones had been in the field for a much longer time, possibly years, and there was very little left to work with. No clothing. No personal items that could provide a clue to the victim's identity. The forensic team did what they could, examining the bones for age, sex, and any distinguishing features. But in 1984, without DNA technology, identifying an unknown set of skeletal remains was an enormous challenge. It would take years, decades in fact, before the second victim from the Calder Road field was identified. Her name, investigators eventually determined, was Laura Miller. Laura Miller. Remember that name, because Laura's case is one of the central threads in the Texas killing field story, and her father, Tim Miller, would become one of the most important figures in the long, painful fight for justice. Laura was 16 years old when she disappeared. She was a student at Clear Creek High School in League City. She was, by all accounts, a sweet, gentle girl who loved horses and dreamed of one day working with animals. She was close to her father, Tim, who had raised her after her parents' divorce. Tim Miller was a hard-working man, a blue-collar Texan who loved his daughter more than anything in the world. He was protective of her, the way fathers are protective of their daughters, but he also gave her space to grow and to become her own person. He trusted her. He believed in her. On September 10, 1984, Laura Miller left her home in League City, telling her father that she was going to take a walk to the local convenience store. It was a short walk, less than a mile, along a route she had taken many times before. Tim Miller had no reason to worry. Laura was 16. She was responsible. She knew the area. She would be back in a few minutes. She was not back in an hour. She was not back by nightfall. And when Tim Miller called the police to report his daughter missing, he began a journey that would consume the rest of his life. The police searched for Laura. Volunteers searched for Laura. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months, and Laura Miller did not come home. What Tim Miller did not know, what no one knew at the time, was that Laura's remains were already in the Calder Road field, lying in the same patch of ground where Hyde Villarreal fly had been found months earlier. But because the second set of remains from the 1984 discovery had not yet been identified, no one made the connection. Laura's father spent months searching for her, driving the streets of League City, putting up flyers, talking to anyone who would listen, and all the while, his daughter's bones were lying in a field less than 3 miles from his home. It was not until years later, when advances in forensic technology made it possible to extract DNA from the remains and compare it to reference samples, that the second Calder Road victim was positively identified as Laura Miller. By that time, Tim Miller had already transformed his grief into action, unable to bear the not knowing, unable to accept the silence and the inaction and the slow grinding of the bureaucratic wheels. He had founded an organization called Texas EcoSearch, a volunteer search and recovery team that uses horses, all-terrain vehicles, boats, and trained volunteers to search for missing persons. Texas EcoSearch has, since its founding, assisted in thousands of searches across the country and around the world. It has helped find missing children, missing adults, missing disaster victims. It has brought closure to hundreds of families who, like Tim Miller, were trapped in the terrible limbo of not knowing. Tim Miller built Texas EcoSearch out of his pain. He turned the worst thing that ever happened to him into something that helps other people. And that is one of the few genuinely redemptive elements in this entire dark story. But it does not change the fact that his daughter was murdered. It does not change the fact that someone took Laura Miller from her home, and her father and her future, and left her in a field to rot. And it does not change the fact that, for a very long time, no one was held accountable. The discovery of 2 bodies in the Calder Road field in 1984 should have been a turning point. It should have triggered a massive, coordinated investigation involving multiple agencies, pooling resources and sharing information and working together to identify the killer or killers who were using this stretch of land as a dumping ground. But that is not what happened. Instead, the cases were investigated separately by different agencies with different priorities and different levels of commitment. The Hyde Villarreal case was handled by one department. The unidentified remains, the ones that would later be identified as Laura Miller, were handled by another, and the two investigations never fully merged. This is a recurring theme in the Texas killing field story, the failure of law enforcement agencies to communicate with each other, to share information, to see the bigger picture. The Interstate 45 corridor runs through multiple jurisdictions: Galveston County, Brazoria County, Harris County, and the various cities and towns within them. Each jurisdiction has its own police department, its own sheriff's office, its own set of detectives and procedures and priorities. And in the 1970s and 80s, the idea of multi-jurisdictional task forces and shared databases and coordinated investigations was still in its infancy. Each department guarded its own cases, its own files, its own leads. And in the gaps between them, the killer or killers found room to operate. It is a bitter irony. The same fragmentation that made the Interstate 45 corridor vulnerable to predators also made it nearly impossible to catch them. A killer who abducted a victim in one county and dumped the body in another could, in effect, exploit the jurisdictional boundaries to evade detection. The detectives in one county might have a piece of the puzzle. The detectives in the next county might have another piece. But because they never sat down together and compared notes, the full picture never emerged. This would change eventually, but not soon enough, and not before more young women were killed. The mid-1980s brought more disappearances along the corridor, more families shattered, more names added to the growing list. And as the body count climbed, so did the fear. People in League City and Texas City and Dickinson and the other communities along Interstate 45 began to realize that something was very wrong. That the disappearances were not random. That there was a pattern. And that whoever was responsible was still out there, still hunting. Still taking young women from the streets and the stores and the parking lots and leaving their bodies in the fields and the marshes and the ditches. Mothers began driving their daughters to school instead of letting them walk. Parents set stricter curfews. Young women stopped hitchhiking, stopped walking alone, stopped going out after dark. The sense of safety that had once defined these small, quiet communities was gone, replaced by a pervasive low-level dread that colored everything. People locked their doors. People looked over their shoulders. People whispered about the killing fields in the same hushed, fearful tones that people in other parts of the country reserved for hurricanes and tornadoes. And still, no one was caught. The question that hung over everything, the question that detectives and journalists and community members asked again and again, was simple and devastating. Was it one killer? Or were there multiple killers operating along the same stretch of highway, independently of each other, drawn to the same vulnerable population and the same isolated dumping grounds? The answer, as it would eventually emerge, was both. The Texas killing fields were not the work of a single serial killer. They were the product of a perfect storm of factors: a vulnerable population of young women, an isolated and desolate landscape, a fragmented law enforcement system, and the presence of multiple predators, some of them acting alone, some of them possibly connected, all of them exploiting the same set of conditions to commit their crimes. This made the investigation exponentially more difficult. A single serial killer, however elusive, leaves a signature, a pattern, a consistent method that can eventually be identified and tracked. But multiple killers, operating independently, leave multiple signatures, multiple patterns, multiple sets of evidence that do not necessarily fit together. And the temptation for investigators is to try to force all the cases into a single narrative, to look for one monster who is responsible for everything, when in fact, the truth is far more complex and far more frightening. The truth is that the Interstate 45 corridor was not haunted by one predator. It was haunted by many. And the landscape, the geography, the sociology of the area created conditions that were almost perfectly designed to allow them to thrive. Think about it. A major highway connecting two large cities, providing easy access and easy escape, a transient population with people constantly moving in and out of the area for work, especially in the oil and petrochemical industries. a large number of bars, clubs, and adult entertainment venues catering to the refinery workers and the sailors and the truckers who passed through. A significant population of young living in precarious circumstances, some of them runaways, some of them involved in sex work, some of them simply poor and struggling and doing whatever they could to survive. And a law enforcement infrastructure that was fragmented, underfunded, and often overwhelmed. It was, in the language of criminal profiling, a target-rich environment. And the predators knew it. As the 1980s wore on, the cases continued to accumulate, and the Calder Road field, that desolate patch of marshy ground near League City, continued to give up its dead. In 1986, 2 years after the discovery of Hyde Villarreal Fye and the unidentified remains that would later be identified as Laura Miller, another body was found in the same area. This time, the victim was quickly identified. Her name was Janet Doe, a placeholder name given to her because, for many years, her real identity could not be determined. She was later identified through forensic genealogy, but at the time she was simply another anonymous victim, another young woman whose life had been stolen and whose death had gone unnoticed. The accumulation of bodies in and around the Calder Road field was deeply unsettling to the people of League City. The field was not far from residential neighborhoods. People drove past it on their way to work, on their way to the grocery store, on their way to pick up their kids from school. And every time they drove past it, they thought about what was buried there. What might still be buried there? What might be buried there tomorrow? The field became a symbol, a physical manifestation of the fear and the grief and the frustration that had been building in the community for years. It was the place where the dead were left, the place where young women were discarded, the place where the killer or killers came, in the darkness, to deposit the evidence of their crimes and then drive away, back to the highway, back to their lives, back to the world of the living, leaving their victims behind in the tall grass and the standing water and the silence. And it was in this climate of fear and frustration that the case would take its next, devastating turn. Because the killing was far from over. The 1990s were coming, and with them, new suspects, and new horrors that would push the Texas Killing Fields case into the national spotlight and force the world to confront the question that had haunted the communities along Interstate 45 for nearly 2 decades. How many more would die before someone was caught? The 1990s arrived along the Gulf Coast of Texas the way they arrived everywhere else, with the quiet turning of a calendar page, with New Year's fireworks over Galveston Bay, with the usual promises of fresh starts and better days. But along the Interstate 45 corridor, the new decade brought no fresh start. The darkness that had settled over the communities between Houston and Galveston did not lift with the changing of the year. If anything, it deepened, because the 1990s would produce some of the most devastating and high-profile cases in the entire Killing Fields saga. Cases that would finally force the nation to pay attention to what had been happening in this forgotten stretch of Texas for nearly 20 years. And it began with a girl named Laura Smither. Laura Kate Smither was 12 years old. She lived with her family in Friendswood, Texas, a small affluent suburb located just north of Lead City, nestled between Houston and the coast. Friendswood was, in many ways, the opposite of the rough, working-class communities where many of the earlier Killing Fields victims had lived. It was prosperous. It was well-maintained. The homes were large and comfortable, set on tree-lined streets with manicured lawns. The schools were excellent. The crime rate was negligible. Friendswood was the kind of place where families moved specifically because it was safe, because it was the kind of town where a child could ride her bike to a friend's house or go for a jog in the morning without any warning. Laura Smither was one of those children. She was bright and talented, a gifted young dancer who spent hours practicing ballet and dreaming of a career on a stage. She was slender and graceful, with long brown hair and a warm, easy smile. She was close to her parents, Bob and Gay Smither, who were devoted to their daughter and supportive of her ambitions. She had a younger brother. She had friends. She had a life that was full and rich and promising in every way. On the morning of April 3, 1997, Laura Smither went for a jog near her home. It was early. The air still cool from the night before, the streets quiet and empty. Laura liked to run. It was part of her training as a dancer, a way to build stamina and strength. She left the house in her jogging clothes, followed her usual route through the neighborhood, and disappeared. When Laura did not return home that morning, her parents were immediately alarmed. This was not like her. Laura was responsible, punctual, the kind of girl who always let her parents know where she was. Bob Smither called the police. Within hours, a massive search was underway. Hundreds of volunteers turned out, combing the streets and fields and parks of Friendswood, calling Laura's name, looking behind every bush and under every bridge and in every ditch. Tim Miller, the father of Laura Miller, the girl whose remains had been found in the Calder Road field more than a decade earlier, brought his Texas search team to join the search. Tim Miller knew, better than anyone, what the Smither family was going through. He knew the terror of a missing child. He knew the agony of waiting. And he knew with a sickening certainty that he kept to himself, that the odds of finding Laura Smither alive were slim. The search for Laura Smither lasted 17 days. 17 days of hope and dread, of press conferences and prayer vigils, of helicopters circling overhead and search dogs working through the brush. The case made national news. For the first time, the mainstream media began to pay serious attention to the pattern of disappearances along the Interstate 45 corridor. Reporters descended on Friendswood and League City and the surrounding communities, asking questions that the locals had been asking for years. How many young women had disappeared in this area? Why had so few of the cases been solved? Was there a serial killer operating along the highway? The answers, when they came, were deeply unsatisfying. Nobody knew exactly how many women had disappeared. The estimates ranged from 20 to 30 to more than 40, depending on which cases you included and how broadly you defined the geographic area. Nobody knew why so few of the cases had been solved, and nobody could say with certainty whether there was a single serial killer, or multiple killers, or some combination of the two. On April 20, 1997, Laura Smither's body was found. She was discovered in a retention pond near Friendswood, partially submerged in the water. She had been beaten. She had been strangled. The details of what had been done to her are too painful to describe in full, and out of respect for her family, I will not attempt to do so. Suffice it to say that Laura Smither, a 12-year-old girl who loved ballet and had gone for a morning jog, had been subjected to unspeakable violence before she died. The discovery of Laura's body devastated the community. Friendswood, which had always considered itself a safe haven, was forced to confront the reality that the evil they had heard about, the evil that had been stalking the Interstate 45 corridor for 2 decades, was not confined to the rough side of the tracks. It could reach into the nicest neighborhoods. It could take the brightest, most beloved children. It could happen anywhere, to anyone. The investigation into Laura Smither's murder was intense. Multiple law enforcement agencies were involved, including the Friendswood Police Department, the Galveston County Sheriff's Office, the Texas Rangers, and the FBI. Thousands of tips poured in. Hundreds of potential suspects were investigated. And yet, for months, the case remained unsolved. The break, when it came, led investigators to a man named William Lewis Reese. William Reese was a truck driver. He was 37 years old at the time of Laura Smither's disappearance, a large, heavy-set man with a thick neck and small, dark eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He had a criminal record. In 1986, he had been convicted of kidnapping a young woman in Oklahoma, binding her with duct tape, and sexually assaulting her. He had served time in prison for that crime and had been released in the mid-1990s. After his release, he had moved to the Houston area, where he found work as a truck driver, hauling loads along the highways of southeast Texas, along the Interstate 45 corridor. Reese came to the attention of investigators in May of 1997, just weeks after Laura Smither's body was found. On May 17th, a young woman named Sandra Sapov was driving along a road near Lead City when her car broke down. She was standing on the shoulder, trying to figure out what to do, when a truck pulled over and a man got out. He offered to help. Sandra accepted. And then the man got her, forced her into his truck, and drove away. Sandra Sapah fought back. She fought with everything she had. She scratched and kicked and screamed and, at one point, managed to grab the steering wheel of the truck, causing it to swerve off the road. When the truck came to a stop, she threw open the door, tumbled out onto the ground, and ran. She ran until she found help. She ran until she was safe. Sandra Sapah survived. And when the police found the man who had attacked her, they found William Reese. Reese was arrested and charged with the kidnapping and attempted murder of Sandra Sapah. And as investigators began to dig into his background, they became increasingly convinced that he was responsible for much more than a single kidnapping. His movements, his work schedule, his known locations, they all overlapped with the times and places where young women had disappeared along the Interstate 45 corridor. And his criminal history, the kidnapping and assault in Oklahoma, demonstrated that he was capable of extreme violence against women. But proving that Reese was responsible for the murder of Laura Smither, or for any of the other Killing Fields cases, was a different matter entirely. Reese denied everything. He admitted to kidnapping Sandra Sapah eventually, but he insisted that he had nothing to do with Laura Smither, or any of the other missing and murdered women. And the physical evidence, while suggestive, was not conclusive. There was no DNA linking Reese to Laura Smither's body. There was no eyewitness who had seen him with her. There was no confession. Reese was convicted of the kidnapping of Sandra Sapah and sentenced to 60 years in prison. And for a time, that seemed like it might be the end of his story. He was behind bars. He was not going to hurt anyone else. And the question of whether he had killed Laura Smither, and possibly others, was left unanswered. But the story of William Reese was far from over. We will return to him later, because what happened with Reese many years after his conviction would become one of the most significant developments in the entire Texas Killing Fields case. For now, let us stay in the 1990s, because even as the investigation into Laura Smither's murder was unfolding, another young woman had already vanished, and her case would become one of the most heartbreaking and closely followed in the history of the Killing Fields. Her name was Jessica Cain. Jessica Cain was 17 years old. She was a senior at Clear Creek High School, the same school that Laura Miller had attended more than a decade earlier. Jessica was outgoing and vivacious, the kind of girl who lit up a room when she walked in. She had a wide circle of friends, a loving family, and a future that seemed full of possibilities. She wanted to study theater in college. She loved performing. She had a quick wit and a loud, infectious laugh and a way of making everyone around her feel included and valued. On the evening of August 17, 1997, just 4 months after Laura Smither's body was found, Jessica Cain went to a restaurant in Clear Lake with a group of friends. They had dinner. They laughed and talked and enjoyed each other's company. It was a normal evening, the kind of evening that 17-year-olds have all the time, unremarkable in every way except that it was the last normal evening of Jessica Cain's life. Jessica left the restaurant shortly after midnight, driving home alone in her truck. The drive was short, just a few miles along Interstate 45. She had made the drive hundreds of times before. It was routine, automatic. She would have been on the highway for only a few minutes before taking her exit and heading home. She never arrived the next morning. Jessica's truck was found on the shoulder of Interstate 45, near the exit for Calder Road. The driver's side door was open. The engine was off. Jessica's purse was still inside the cab. Her shoes were on the floor of the passenger side. There was no sign of damage to the truck. No flat tire, no mechanical failure, no indication of an accident. It was as if Jessica had simply stopped the truck, opened the door, stepped out, and vanished into the night. But Jessica Cain had not stepped out of her truck voluntarily. Someone had made her stop. Someone had taken her, and Jessica Cain was gone. The Cain family's ordeal was agonizing. Jessica's father, C.H. Cain, was a big barrel-chested man with a booming voice and a fierce, protective love for his daughter. When Jessica disappeared, he threw himself into the search with a desperation that was painful to witness. He organized search parties. He canvassed the area around where her truck had been found. He walked the fields and the ditches and the marshy lowlands, looking for any trace of his daughter. He went on television. pleading for anyone with information to come forward. He offered rewards. He begged, and he got nothing. The police investigated. They searched the area around the abandoned truck. They interviewed Jessica's friends and family. They looked at her phone records, her daily routines, her social connections. They considered every possibility: an accident, a voluntary disappearance, foul play, and quickly concluded that foul play was the most likely explanation. A 17-year-old girl does not leave her truck on the side of the highway in the middle of the night, with her purse and shoes inside, and walk away voluntarily. Something had happened to Jessica Kane. Something terrible, but what and who was responsible? The location where Jessica's truck was found was significant. It was near Calder Road, the same area where the bodies of Hyde Virial Fye and Laura Miller had been discovered in 1984. The same desolate, marshy stretch of land that had become synonymous with the killing fields. The proximity was impossible to ignore. Whoever had taken Jessica Kane had taken her from the same area where other young women had been taken before. It was as if the killing fields were pulling victims into their orbit, drawing them in with some terrible gravitational force. Suspicion quickly fell on William Reese. He was already in custody for the kidnapping of Sandra Sapal, and the timeline of Jessica Kane's disappearance fell within the period when Reese was known to be active in the area. But again, there was no direct evidence linking him to Jessica. No physical evidence. No confession. No eyewitness. Just the sickening coincidence of geography and timing and the knowledge that a violent predator had been operating in the exact area where Jessica had vanished. Jessica Kane's body was never found. Not in the 1990s. Not in the 2000s. For years her family lived in the worst kind of limbo, unable to mourn, unable to move on, unable to do anything except wait and hope and pray for a resolution that never came. Her father, C.H. Kane, never recovered from the loss. He spent the rest of his life searching for Jessica, looking for answers, demanding justice. And when he died years later, he died without knowing what had happened to his daughter. The cases of Laura Smither and Jessica Kane, occurring just months apart in 1997, had a profound impact on the public perception of the Texas killing fields. These were not anonymous, marginalized victims whose disappearances could be easily dismissed or ignored. Laura Smither was a middle-class girl from an affluent suburb. Jessica Kane was a popular high school senior from a well-known local family. Their cases generated intense media coverage and public outrage. People who had never heard of the killing fields suddenly became aware of the decades-long pattern of violence along Interstate 45. And the pressure on law enforcement to solve the cases, to find the killer or killers, to do something, became immense. But the pressure did not immediately produce results. The cases remained open. The suspects remained uncharged. And the families remained in agony. Meanwhile, the Calder Road field had not finished giving up its secrets. In the years following the discovery of Virial Fye and Laura Miller, additional remains were found in the same area. Some were identified, some were not. Each discovery added another layer of horror to an already horrifying story. The field, it seemed, was a repository of death, a place where multiple killers, over multiple years, had come to dispose of their victims. One of the most disturbing discoveries was the remains of a young woman found in 1991 in a marshy area near Calder Road. She was identified as Donna Gonsalon Pruitt, a 34-year-old woman from Dickinson, Texas, who had disappeared in July of that year. Donna was a mother. She had 3 children. She was in the process of divorcing her husband, a man named John Robert Pruitt, and the separation had been acrimonious. John Pruitt had a history of domestic violence. He had been physically abusive toward Donna, and when Donna disappeared, he was the immediate suspect. The investigation into Donna Pruitt's disappearance and murder was complicated by the same jurisdictional issues that had plagued every other killing fields case. Donna had disappeared from Dickinson, which was in Galveston County. Her body was found near League City, which was also in Galveston County, but was a separate municipality with its own police department. The case fell between jurisdictions, with different agencies handling different aspects of the investigation. John Pruitt was eventually charged with Donna's murder, but the case against him was largely circumstantial. There was evidence of his abusive behavior. There was evidence that he had threatened Donna. There was the obvious motive, a contentious divorce. But there was no forensic evidence directly linking him to the murder scene. And the condition of Donna's remains, when they were found, made it difficult to establish a cause of death with certainty. The trial of John Pruitt was a roller coaster. The prosecution presented a compelling narrative of a violent, controlling husband who had murdered his wife to prevent her from leaving him. The defense argued that the evidence was insufficient and that Donna could have been killed by someone else, possibly one of the unknown predators who had been stalking the Interstate 45 corridor for years. The defense pointed to the location where the body was found, the Calder Road area, the same killing ground where other victims had been dumped, and argued that this suggested a serial killer, not a jealous husband. The jury convicted John Pruitt of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, but the case remained controversial. Some investigators believed that Pruitt was guilty and that the verdict was correct. Others were not so sure. They pointed out that the Calder Road area had been used as a dumping ground by multiple perpetrators, and that the presence of Donna's body in that area did not necessarily mean her husband had put her there. The truth, as with so much in the Texas killing field story, remained elusive. The Pruitt case illustrates one of the most challenging aspects of the killing fields investigation. When you have an area that has been used as a dumping ground by multiple killers over many years, it becomes extremely difficult to determine which killer is responsible for which victim. The geography becomes contaminated in a sense, with so many overlapping patterns of criminal behavior that separating them into distinct, prosecutable cases is almost impossible. Every time a body is found in the Calder Road area, the question arises: is this the work of the same person who killed the other victims found here, or is it someone else entirely? And the answer, in most cases, is impossible to determine with certainty. This ambiguity haunts the entire killing field saga. It haunts the investigators, who can never be quite sure whether they're looking for one killer or many. It haunts the families, who can never be quite sure whether the person who murdered their loved one is the same person who murdered someone else's loved one, or whether their case is completely unrelated. And it haunts the communities along Interstate 45, who can never be quite sure whether the threat is past or whether it is still out there, waiting, watching, choosing its next victim. As the 1990s drew to a close, the Texas killing fields had claimed at least 30 victims, possibly more. The exact number depends on which cases you include and how you define the geographic boundaries, and reasonable people can and do disagree about the count. But by any measure, the toll was staggering. 30 or more young women dead or missing over a span of nearly 3 decades. And a handful of suspects, some of them charged, some of them convicted, but none of them clearly responsible for the full scope of the carnage. The public outcry that followed the disappearances of Laura Souther and Jessica Kane had one significant positive effect. It forced law enforcement agencies to begin working together in ways they had not before. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, a series of task forces and multi-agency initiatives were created to address the killing fields cases. The FBI became involved, the Texas Rangers stepped up their presence, and detectives from multiple jurisdictions began, for the first time, to sit down together and compare notes, share information, and look for connections between cases. The formation of these task forces was a critical step forward, but it was also frustrating. Many of the cases dated back decades. Evidence had been lost, degraded, or improperly stored. Witnesses had moved away, forgotten key details, or died. Crime scenes had been contaminated by time and weather and the natural processes of decomposition. And the suspects, those who were still alive, had had years to refine their stories, to cover their tracks, to settle into the comfortable routine of denial. But the task forces also brought new tools to the investigation. DNA technology, which had been in its infancy in the 1980s, was now powerful enough to extract genetic material from evidence that was decades old. Computer databases made it possible to cross-reference cases from different jurisdictions, looking for patterns and connections that might have been invisible to individual detectives working in isolation. And forensic genealogy, a technique that uses DNA evidence in conjunction with publicly available genealogical databases to identify unknown victims and suspects, was beginning to emerge as a revolutionary new tool in the fight against violent crime. These new tools would eventually produce breakthroughs. But the process was slow, painstaking, and often heartbreaking. For every case that was solved, there were many more that remained open. For every family that received answers, there were many more that continued to wait, and the waiting was perhaps the worst part. The families of the Killing Fields victims lived in a state of perpetual uncertainty, a limbo that is almost impossible for outsiders to comprehend. They did not know what had happened to their loved ones. They did not know who was responsible. They did not know whether the killer was still alive, still free, still walking the same streets they walked. They did not know whether they would ever receive justice, or whether the cases would simply fade away, unsolved and forgotten, buried under the weight of time and indifference. Some of the families channeled their grief into activism. Tim Miller, as we have already discussed, founded Texas EquuSearch and devoted his life to helping other families of missing persons. The parents of Laura Smither became advocates for child safety and victims' rights. The Kane family lobbied for tougher laws and better coordination between law enforcement agencies. These families refused to be silent. They refused to accept that the murders of their daughters were simply unsolvable. And their persistence, their refusal to give up, would eventually prove to be one of the most important factors in advancing the investigation. But there were other families who did not have the resources, or the energy, or the temperament for activism. Families who suffered in silence, who grieved behind closed doors, who slowly fell apart under the weight of their loss. Mothers who developed chronic health problems from the stress. Fathers who turned to alcohol. Siblings who grew up in the shadow of a tragedy that defined their entire family. The collateral damage of the Texas Killing Fields extended far beyond the victims themselves. It radiated outward, touching everyone who loved them, everyone who knew them, everyone who lived in the communities where they had lived. And then there were the unsolved identities. The Jane Does. The women and girls whose remains were found along the Interstate 45 corridor, but who could not be identified. Who were they? Where had they come from? Did they have families somewhere? Families who were still searching for them, still hoping, still waiting for a phone call that would never come. Or had they been so thoroughly erased from the world that no one even knew they were missing? The Jane Does of the Killing Fields are perhaps the most haunting aspect of the entire story, because a murder is terrible, but a murder where the victim is unknown, where no one even knows their name, where they are buried in an unmarked grave and remembered only as a case number in a police file. That is something worse. A complete and total obliteration of a human life. And it is a reminder that in this world, there are people who can disappear and not be missed. People whose absence leaves no void. People who, in the eyes of society, were never fully visible to begin with. I think about those women sometimes. The Jane Does. I wonder who they were. I wonder what they looked like. I wonder whether they had nicknames, whether they liked chocolate or vanilla, whether they were morning people or night owls, whether they laughed loudly or quietly, whether anyone ever told them they were loved. These are the details that make a person, and without them, the Jane Does of the Killing Fields remain shadows, outlines, negative space where a human life should be. But even the shadows have stories, and in some cases years or decades after their deaths, those stories would finally be told. Let me take you back to the Calder Road field one more time. Because in 1991, in addition to the remains of Donna Gonsoulin Pruitt, another set of skeletal remains was found in the same area. These remains belonged to a young woman who could not be immediately identified. She was designated as Jane Doe, and her case file was added to the growing stack of unsolved Killing Fields cases. For years, investigators tried to determine who she was. They compared her dental records and physical description to missing persons from across the state and across the country. They consulted with forensic anthropologists who examined her bones for any distinguishing features. They circulated composite sketches based on estimated appearance of her face. And for years, they got nothing. No match, no identification, no answers. It was not until 2019, nearly 3 decades after her remains were found, that advances in forensic genealogy finally cracked the case. Using DNA extracted from the remains and cross-referencing with genealogical databases, investigators were able to build a family tree that led them to the victim's identity. Her name was Audrey Lee Cook. Audrey Lee Cook. She had been born in 1955 in Memphis, Tennessee. She had grown up in a troubled home, had moved around frequently, and had eventually made her way to the Houston area. She was last known to be alive in the early 1980s. She had been in her late 20s or early 30s when she died. And for nearly 3 decades no one had reported her missing. Think about that. A woman was murdered, her body dumped in a field, and for almost 30 years no one reported her missing. No one came looking for her. No one called the police. No one put up flyers. Her absence from the world was so complete, so unremarkable, that it simply went unnoticed. The identification of Audrey Lee Cook was both a triumph and a tragedy. A triumph because it gave her back her name, her identity, her place in the world. And a tragedy because it underscored just how invisible some of these victims had been, how completely they had been erased, not just by their killers, but by the circumstances of their lives. Around the same time that Audrey Lee Cook was identified, another long-standing Jane Doe from the Calder Road field was also identified using forensic genealogy. Her name was Donna Prudhomme. Like Audrey, Donna had been a drifter, a woman living on the margins, moving from place to place, disconnected from family and community. And like Audrey, she had been murdered and dumped in the field, and no one had reported her missing. The identification of Audrey Lee Cook and Donna Prudhomme represented a significant advance in the Killing Fields investigation. For the first time, investigators had names and backgrounds for victims who had been anonymous for decades. And with those names came new leads, new avenues of investigation, new possibilities for identifying the killers. But the identifications also raised new questions. Who had killed Audrey and Donna? Were they victims of the same person who had killed Valerio Fay and Laura Miller, whose bodies had also been found in the Calder Road field? Or were they killed by different perpetrators? And how many other victims were still out there, buried in the marshland, waiting to be found? These questions hung in the air as the investigation moved into the 2000s. The task forces were still active. The detectives were still working. The families were still waiting. And the Killing Fields, that desolate stretch of land near League City, still held its secrets. But the biggest breakthroughs in the case were still to come. And they would involve 2 men whose names would become synonymous with the Texas Killing Fields. Men who had been hiding in plain sight for decades. Men whose crimes were so extensive and so calculating that even the detectives who eventually caught them could not quite believe what they had found. One of those men was Robert Abel. The other was William Reese, and the stories of both men, their crimes, their investigations, their eventual fates, would reshape everything anyone thought they knew about the Texas Killing Fields. But those stories require time and care to tell properly, and the hour is growing late. So let us pause here at the threshold of a new century, with the task forces assembled and the new technology deployed and the old cases finally being re-examined with fresh eyes and sharper tools. The answers are coming, slowly, painfully, incompletely, but they are coming. And when they arrive, they will be more shocking, more disturbing, and more heartbreaking than could have imagined. The Killing Fields are not finished with us yet. Now, let us talk about Robert Abel, because his story is one of the strangest, most controversial, and most deeply unsettling chapters in the entire Texas Killing Fields saga. It is a story that raises questions not only about guilt and innocence, but about the nature of suspicion itself, about what happens when a community is so desperate for answers that it begins to see monsters everywhere, and about the terrible, irreversible damage that can be done to a person's life when the finger of accusation points in their direction. Whether or not the accusation is true, Robert William Abel was a retired NASA engineer. He was a highly educated man, intelligent, articulate, and by most accounts somewhat eccentric. He lived on a small ranch property near League City, a piece of land that bordered the open fields and marshy lowlands that had become known as the Killing Fields. His property was not far from Calder Road. In fact, it was close enough to the area where multiple bodies had been found that investigators could not help but notice the proximity. Abel had moved to the property in the 1970s with his wife. He raised horses. He kept to himself for the most part, though he was known to be friendly enough when approached. He was not the kind of man who drew attention to himself. He was quiet, bookish, a scientist by training and by temperament. He was the kind of man you might pass on the street and never look at twice. But Robert Abel had a secret, or rather he had a reputation, one that had been building quietly in the community for years, whispered about in diners and hardware stores and church parking lots. A reputation that would eventually bring the full weight of law enforcement down on his shoulders. The whispers began because of the proximity of his property to the dumping sites. People in League City knew that bodies had been found in the fields near Abel's ranch. They knew that the Killing Fields were, in a very literal sense, in his backyard. And while proximity alone proves nothing, it is hard to live next door to a graveyard of murdered women without people starting to wonder about you. The whispers grew louder when it became known that Abel had a history of picking up young women. According to multiple sources, Abel was to frequent areas where sex workers operated, along the highways and in the seedier parts of the Gulf Coast towns. He was seen giving rides to young women. He was seen in the company of women who matched the general profile of the Killing Fields victims, young, vulnerable, often involved in risky lifestyles. None of this was illegal, but in the context of the Killing Fields investigation, it was deeply suspicious. Investigators began looking at Robert Abel more closely in the early 1990s. After the discovery of additional remains in the Calder Road area, they interviewed him, they surveilled him, they searched his property, and what they found, or rather, what they did not find, only deepened the mystery. There was no physical evidence directly linking Abel to any of the murders. No DNA, no blood, no personal items belonging to any of the victims. His property was searched multiple times, with cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar, and while the dogs did areas, no additional remains were found. Abel himself was cooperative with investigators, at least initially. He answered their questions. He allowed them onto his property. He denied any involvement in the killings and expressed sympathy for the victims and their families. But the circumstantial evidence continued to accumulate. Witnesses came forward claiming they had seen Abel near the locations where victims had last been seen. His ex-wife, after their divorce, made statements to investigators suggesting that Abel had violent tendencies and had behaved in ways that she found frightening. A young woman came forward claiming that Abel had once picked her up and driven her to a remote location, where she had felt threatened and had managed to escape. The details of her account were chilling. Though they fell short of establishing that Abel had intended to harm her, the lead investigator on the Killing Fields task force, a Galveston County detective, became convinced that Robert Abel was the primary suspect. He pursued Abel aggressively, obtaining search warrants, conducting extensive surveillance, and building what he believed was a compelling circumstantial case. The investigation consumed years and significant resources. Abel's name was leaked to the media, and suddenly the quiet, eccentric retired engineer was the most talked about person in League City. Reporters camped outside his ranch. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid him. He received death threats, and through it all, Robert Abel maintained his innocence. The case against Abel never resulted in criminal charges. Despite years of investigation and surveillance, the evidence was simply not strong enough to bring to trial. There was no smoking gun, no confession, no forensic link between Abel and any of the victims. The circumstantial evidence, while troubling, was open to interpretation. The witness accounts were inconsistent and, in some cases, unreliable, and Abel's defense that he was simply an eccentric old man who lived near the wrong piece of land. But the damage was done. Robert Abel's life was destroyed by the investigation. His reputation was ripped apart. His finances were drained by legal fees. His health deteriorated under the constant stress of living as the primary suspect in one of the most notorious serial murder cases in Texas history. He became a recluse, rarely leaving his property, living in a state of siege behind locked gates and drawn curtains. In 2008, Robert Abel was found dead on his property. He had killed himself. He was 73 years old. The death of Robert Abel did not resolve the question of his involvement in the Killing Fields murders. Some investigators continue to believe that he was guilty, that he had taken his secrets to the grave. Others believe that he was innocent, that he had been the victim of an overzealous investigation, and a community desperate for someone to blame. The truth, as with so much in this case, remains uncertain. What is certain is that the investigation of Robert Abel consumed enormous resources and attention. Resources and attention that might have been directed elsewhere. While detectives were focused on Abel, other leads were not being pursued as aggressively. Other suspects were not being investigated as thoroughly, and the real killer, or killers, may have been using that time to cover their tracks, to destroy evidence, to settle into the comfortable anonymity of ordinary life. This is one of the most painful lessons of the Texas Killing Fields case. When an investigation fixates on a single suspect, it can develop a kind of tunnel vision, a narrowing of focus that excludes other possibilities and other leads. And when that suspect turns out to be the wrong person, or when the evidence is simply not strong enough to prove their guilt, the result is a catastrophic waste of time and resources, and a corresponding benefit to the actual perpetrator. Robert Abel may have been guilty, or he may have been innocent. We will probably never know for certain. But his story serves a cautionary tale about the dangers of rushing to judgment, of allowing suspicion to substitute for evidence, and of the terrible human cost of an investigation that goes wrong. Now let us turn to another suspect, one whose story took a very different path. A man whose guilt would eventually be established not through circumstantial evidence and community suspicion, but through cold, hard forensic science and his own words. Let us return to William Reese. When we last discussed Reese, he was sitting in a Texas prison, serving a 60-year sentence for the 1997 kidnapping of Sandra Sapok. He had been a suspect in the disappearance of Laura Smither and Jessica Kane, but no charges had been filed due to insufficient evidence. The cases remained open, the families remained in agony, and Reese remained behind bars, insisting on his innocence. For years, the investigation into Reese's possible connection to the Killing Fields murders continued, slowly and methodically, in the background. Detectives reviewed his movements, his work records, his phone calls, his associations. They looked at every case along the Interstate 45 corridor and tried to determine whether Reese could have been responsible. They sent evidence from old crime scenes to laboratories for DNA testing, hoping that advances in technology might produce a match that had been impossible to detect years earlier. And they waited. Because sometimes in a case like this, waiting is the only strategy that works. Waiting for new evidence to surface. Waiting for new technology to be developed. Waiting for the suspect to make a mistake. To say something he should not have said. To reveal something he had been hiding. The wait lasted nearly 2 decades. In 2014, Reese was facing the possibility of parole. His 60-year sentence under Texas law made him eligible for release after serving a portion of his time. The families of the Killing Fields victims were horrified. The idea that Reese, a man they believed was responsible for the murders of their daughters, might walk free was unbearable. Tim Miller, Laura Miller's father, was vocal in his opposition to Reese's release. The Smither family, the Kane family, and other families whose loved ones had disappeared along the corridor joined the chorus of protest. But the pressure of a potential release also created an opportunity. Investigators in Galveston County and Harris County, working with the Texas Rangers and the FBI, launched a renewed effort to build cases against Reese. They went back to the evidence. They re-interviewed witnesses. They submitted old forensic samples for updated DNA testing. And they did something else, something that would prove to be the key to breaking the case. They began talking to Reese himself. In prison over the years, Reese had apparently been thinking. Whether it was guilt or a desire for attention, or a calculated strategy to gain some advantage, He began slowly and carefully to make statements to investigators. Not full confessions, not at first, but hints, suggestions, fragments of information that only someone with direct knowledge of the crimes could have known. The process was agonizingly slow. Reese was cagey, manipulative, and keenly aware of the legal implications of anything he said. He would offer a piece of information, then retract it. He would admit to being in a certain area at a certain time, then deny it in the next interview. He played games with the investigators, dangling the truth in front of them and then snatching it away. But the investigators were patient. They had been working these cases for years, some of them for their entire careers. They knew how to handle a suspect like Reese. They knew that the key to getting a confession from a man like this was not confrontation or intimidation, but patience, persistence, and the slow, steady building of a relationship in which the suspect feels comfortable enough or cornered enough to finally tell the truth. And eventually, Reese began to talk. The details that emerged were devastating. Reese admitted to killing Laura Smither. He described picking her up as she jogged near her home in Friendswood on that April morning in 1997. He described what he did to her. He described where he left her body. The details he provided were consistent with the known facts of the case, facts that had not been publicly released, facts that only the killer could have known. Reese also admitted to killing Jessica Cain. He described intercepting on Interstate 45 late at night in August of 1997. He described forcing her to stop her truck. He described taking her. And he described what happened next. And when investigators asked him where Jessica's body was, Reese provided information that led them to a location they had not previously searched. And then Reese admitted to something that no one had expected. He admitted to killing a young woman in Oklahoma, a girl named Tiffany Johnston. Tiffany was 19 years old. She had disappeared from a car wash in Bethany, Oklahoma, in July of 1997, just weeks before Jessica Cain vanished. Her body had been found in a field, but her murder had never been conclusively linked to the Texas killing fields. Reese's confession connected the cases for the first time, revealing that his hunting ground extended far beyond the Interstate 45 corridor. The confessions of William Reese were a seismic event in the Texas killing fields investigation. For the first time, a suspect had admitted, in detail, to multiple murders along the corridor. For the first time, the families of Laura Smither and Jessica Cain had answers. Not the answers they wanted. Not the answers that would bring their daughters back, but answers nonetheless. The terrible, crushing, final answers that told them what had happened to their children and who was responsible. In 2016, based on Reese's confessions and the supporting evidence, he was indicted for capital murder in the case of Jessica Cain. The indictment was a landmark moment. For nearly 20 years, Jessica's disappearance had been an open wound, a case without a resolution, a mystery without an answer. Now at last, the legal process could begin. But the road to trial was long and complicated. Reese's defense team challenged the admissibility of his confessions, arguing that they had been coerced. They challenged the forensic evidence, arguing that it was insufficient to support a conviction. And they challenged the timeline, arguing that the prosecution could not prove that Reese had been in the right place at the right time to have committed the crimes. The legal proceedings dragged on for years. During that time, investigators continued to search for Jessica Cain's remains, using the information Reese had provided. In 2019, more than 20 years after Jessica's disappearance, her remains were finally found. They were discovered in a remote area near Houston, in a location consistent with the information Reese had given to investigators. The discovery brought a measure of closure to the Cain family, who could finally lay Jessica to rest. The identification of Jessica's remains also strengthened the case against Reese. It corroborated his confession and demonstrated that he had specific, accurate knowledge of where the body had been left, knowledge that only the killer could possess. Reese was eventually tried and convicted. In the case of Jessica Cain, he was sentenced to death. In the case of Laura Smither, he pleaded guilty to murder and was sentenced to life in prison. And in the case of Tiffany Johnston in Oklahoma, he was also convicted of murder. William Reese, the truck driver who had been hiding in plain sight for decades, was finally held accountable for his crimes. But the convictions, while significant, did not close the book on the Texas killing fields. Because Reese, by his own admission, was responsible for 3 murders, and the total number of victims along the Interstate 45 corridor was far greater than 3. The other cases, the dozens of other young women who had disappeared and died along the highway, remained unsolved. Reese was a piece of the puzzle, an important piece, but he was not the whole puzzle. And this brings us to one of the most important and most disturbing realizations about the Texas killing fields. The idea that there was a single serial killer responsible for all the murders was always a simplification, a narrative convenience that made the story easier to understand, but did not reflect the reality. The reality was far more complex and far more frightening. The Interstate 45 corridor was not the hunting ground of one predator. It was the hunting ground of many. Over the decades, multiple individuals have been identified as suspects or have been convicted of murders along the corridor. In addition to William Reese, there was Edward Harold Bell, a retired optician from League City who confessed to killing multiple young women in the 1970s. Bell's confessions were made in a series of letters he wrote to authorities while serving a prison sentence for another crime, and they were detailed enough to be taken seriously. Though not all of them could be independently verified, Edward Harold Bell was a deeply troubled man. He had a history of mental illness and erratic behavior. In 1978, he had shot and killed a man named Larry Dickens in a bizarre incident that Bell claimed was related to his attempts to expose a child pornography ring. He was convicted of that murder and sentenced to 70 years in prison. While behind bars, he wrote letters to prosecutors and law enforcement officials in which he claimed to have killed 11 teenage girls in the Galveston area in the early 1970s. He referred to his victims as the 11, and he provided names and details that corresponded in some cases to known missing persons cases. Bell's confessions were treated with caution by investigators. He was mentally unstable, and there was a question of whether his claims were genuine confessions or the fantasies of a disturbed mind. Some of the details he provided matched known facts. Others did not, and the passage of time had made it extremely difficult to verify his accounts independently. Edward Harold Bell was paroled in 2013 after serving 35 years of his 70-year sentence. He died in 2019 at the age of 79, without ever being formally charged with any of the killing fields murders. His confessions remain a haunting and unresolved element of the case, a tantalizing possibility that the truth about some of the earliest victims may have been within reach, if only the evidence had been strong enough to act on. Then there was Robert Durst. Yes, that Robert Durst, the New York real estate heir who became the subject of the HBO documentary series The Jinx. Durst lived in Galveston in 2001 under a false identity, disguised as a mute woman. He was linked to the murder and dismemberment of his neighbor, Morris Black, whose body parts were found floating in Galveston Bay. Durst was tried for Black's murder and, astonishingly, was acquitted after his defense team argued that the killing had been in self-defense. Durst was never formally connected to any of the killing fields cases, and there is no credible evidence linking him to the murders of any of the young women who disappeared along the Interstate 45 corridor. But his presence in Galveston during a period when the killing fields investigation was active added yet another layer of darkness to an already dark story. The idea that one of America's most notorious suspected killers had been living in the same area where dozens of young women had been murdered was almost too much to process. It was as if the Interstate 45 corridor had some kind of magnetic pull, attracting predators the way a swamp attracts mosquitoes. Beyond the named suspects, there were others unnamed, unidentified, suspected but never charged. Truckers who passed through the area regularly and whose routes overlapped with the disappearances. Refinery workers with violent histories who lived in the communities along the highway. Transients and drifters who moved to the area and left no trace. The Interstate 45 corridor, with its constant flow of traffic and its transient population, provided an almost perfect cover for predators. They could strike and then disappear, merging back into the river of people and vehicles that float along the highway day and night. The multiplicity of suspects is one of the reasons why the Texas Killing Fields case has been so difficult to solve. It is not one case, it is dozens of cases, overlapping in geography and victimology but potentially unrelated in terms of perpetrators. The challenge for investigators has been to untangle the threads, to separate the cases that are connected from those that are not, and to build individual prosecutions against individual suspects. It is painstaking, exhausting work, and it requires a level of patience and persistence that is almost superhuman, but the work continues. Even now, decades after the first victims disappeared, investigators are still working the cases. New evidence is still being tested, new leads are still being pursued, and new technologies, forensic genealogy chief among them, are still producing identifications and connections that were impossible just a few years ago. The story of the Texas Killing Fields is not over. It may never be fully over. There may always be cases that remain unsolved, victims who remain unidentified, questions that remain unanswered. But the arc of the story, the long, slow arc that stretches from Colette Wilson's disappearance in 1970, to the conviction of William Reese nearly 50 years later, is an arc that bends, however slowly, toward justice. Not perfect justice, not complete justice, but justice nonetheless. And for the families who have waited so long, who have suffered so much, who have refused to give up even when the world told them there was no hope, even imperfect justice is something. It is an acknowledgement that their loved ones mattered, that their lives had value, that their deaths were not acceptable, were not forgettable, were not just part of the cost of living in a violent world. It is an acknowledgement that someone cared enough to keep looking, to keep fighting, to keep demanding answers even when the answers were decades away. And that, in the end, may be the most important thing. The Texas Killing Fields is a story about evil. There is no way around that. It is a story about the terrible things that human beings are capable of doing to one another. But it is also a story about love, about the fierce, unbreakable, transcendent love of parents for their children, of families for their lost members, of communities for their most vulnerable citizens. It is a story about the refusal to accept darkness as the final word, about the insistence, in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary, that the truth matters, that justice matters, that the lives of forgotten women and girls matter, and it is a story that is still being written. The land along Interstate 45 has changed since the 1970s. The open fields have been developed. Housing subdivisions and shopping centers and office parks have sprung up where there was once only grass and marshland. The Calder Road area, the epicenter of the Killing Fields, is no longer as isolated as it once was. There are houses nearby now, streetlights, traffic, but the earth remembers. The ground where those young women were left, where their bodies lay for months and years and decades, does not forget. And if you drive along that stretch of highway today, even with the new development and the new construction and the new veneer of normalcy, you can feel it. A heaviness in the air, a silence that is not quite silence, a sense that something happened here. Something terrible, something that has seeped into the soil and the water and the roots of the grass and will never fully go away. The Texas Killing Fields are quiet now, but they are not empty. They are full of memory, full of grief, full of unanswered questions and unfinished stories, and the restless spirits of women and girls who deserve so much better than what they got. And they are waiting for the last secrets to be told, waiting for the last names to be spoken, waiting for the last measure of justice to be delivered. They have been waiting for a very long time. Now I want to take you deeper into the lives of the victims, because it is easy in a case like this, where the numbers are large and the timeline is long and the suspects are many, to lose the individual in the crowd. To start thinking of these women and girls as a collective, as a group, as a category. The Killing Fields victims. But they were not a category, they were people. Each one of them had a name, a face, a voice, a way of laughing, a favorite song, a person they loved, a dream they were chasing. And I think it is important, even necessary, to slow down and remember some of them as individuals. Not as data points in a criminal investigation, not as names on a list, but as the living, breathing, irreplaceable human beings they were before someone decided that their lives did not matter. Let me tell you more about Hyde Villarreal Fye, because her story, beyond the bare facts of her disappearance and death, is a story about the kind of woman who becomes invisible in a world that only pays attention to certain kinds of people. Hyde was born in 1960. She grew up in a working-class family. Her life from the beginning was marked by instability and struggle. She moved frequently. She had difficulty finding steady employment. She fell into relationships that were unhealthy and sometimes dangerous. She struggled with substance abuse, a battle that consumed much of her young adult life and made everything else harder: finding work, maintaining relationships, staying in one place long enough to boot anything resembling stability. By the time she was in her early 20s, Hyde was living in League City, drifting between temporary housing and homes of friends and acquaintances. She was 23 years old. She was trying to get her life together. She had moments of clarity and hope, moments when she believed that things could get better, that she could break free from the cycle of addiction and instability that had defined her adult life. And maybe she could have. Maybe given enough time and enough support and enough luck, she would have turned things around. People do it every day. People who are deeper in the hole than Hyde ever was find their way out. It happens, but Hyde never got the chance. On October 10, 1983, Hyde Villarreal Fye was last seen alive. The circumstances of her disappearance are murky. She was living a chaotic life, moving between locations, associating with people who were themselves unstable and unreliable. When she stopped showing up, when she stopped being seen in the places where she usually was, nobody raised an immediate alarm. People assumed she had moved on. People assumed she had gone to another town, another city, another temporary arrangement. People assumed she was fine. She was not fine, she was dead. Her body was lying in a field off Calder Road, hidden by the tall grass, decomposing in the Gulf Coast heat, waiting to be found. When her remains were discovered in February 1984, the investigation was hampered by the same factors that hampered so many of the Killing Fields cases. There was very little physical evidence. The body had been exposed to the elements for months, and the degree of decomposition made it difficult to determine a precise cause of death. There were no witnesses. There was no clear crime scene. There was nothing to go on except a name, a set of bones, and the knowledge that another young woman had been murdered and discarded like waste. I linger on Hyde's story because she represents a type that appears again and again in the Texas Killing Fields saga. A young woman living on the margins. A young woman whose lifestyle made her vulnerable. A young woman who, in the cold calculus of the world, was considered expendable. Not by the people who loved her. Not by the people who knew her. But by the system, by the institutions that were supposed to protect her. By the broader society that had already written her off. The term that law enforcement sometimes uses is less dead. It is a terrible term, but it describes a terrible reality. Some victims, because of their background, their lifestyle, their social status, receive less attention, less investigative effort, less public concern when they go missing or are found dead. They are less dead in the eyes of the world, their murders treated as less urgent, less important, less worthy of the full resources and attention of the justice system. Hyde Villarreal Fye was one of the less dead, and so were many of the other Killing Fields victims. This is not an accusation directed at any individual detective or police department. Many of the investigators who worked the Killing Fields cases were deeply committed, genuinely caring people who worked long hours and sacrificed their personal lives in pursuit of justice for the victims. But they were operating within a system that was not designed to prioritize cases like these. A system that allocated resources based on public pressure, media attention, and political considerations. And in that system, the murder of a young woman from a troubled background in a small Gulf Coast town simply did not generate the same level of urgency as the murder of a wealthy housewife in a Houston suburb. The result was a two-tiered system of justice, one for the visible and one for the invisible. And the killers who preyed on the invisible knew this. They knew that their crimes would not make the front page. They knew that the investigations would be understaffed and underfunded. They knew that the world would not mourn their victims the way it would mourn a missing child from a wealthy family. And this knowledge emboldened them. It gave them confidence. It gave them space to operate. This dynamic began to shift, as we discussed earlier, when the victims started coming from more visible, more affluent backgrounds. The disappearances of Laura Smither and Jessica Kane in 1997 were watershed moments precisely because they broke the pattern. These were not marginalized women living on the edges of society. These were middle-class girls from respectable families, the kind of victims whose cases generate immediate, intense media coverage and public outcry. And when their cases were linked to the broader pattern of violence along Interstate 45, the world finally began to pay attention to what had been happening for decades. But I want to be clear about something. The fact that it took the disappearances of middle-class victims to generate widespread attention does not diminish the lives or the deaths of the earlier victims. Colette Wilson mattered. Brenda Jones and Georgia Geer mattered. Debbie Ackerman and Maria Johnson mattered. Haid Villarreal mattered. Every single one of them mattered. And the fact that their cases did not receive the same level of attention and resources as the later cases is not a reflection of their worth as human beings. It is a reflection of the failures of a system that should have done better. That should have treated every murdered woman as equally important, equally deserving of justice, regardless of her background or her lifestyle or the size of her parents' bank account. Now let me tell you about another victim whose story deserves to be told in full. A woman whose case illustrates, with heartbreaking clarity, the human cost of the killing fields. Her name was Crystal John Baker. She was 13 years old. Crystal was born in 1983. She lived in Texas City, one of the industrial towns along the Interstate 45 corridor. She was a 7th grader. She was small for her age, with a round face and dark eyes that photographs suggest were always watching, always taking things in. She was gentle. She liked to draw. She liked animals. She was the kind of girl who noticed things that other people missed. The kind of girl who would pick up a stray kitten or share her lunch with a classmate who had forgotten theirs. Crystal lived with her grandmother, Janie Baker. Jeannie was the anchor of Crystal's life, the steady, loving presence that kept the girl grounded in a world that was not always kind to her. Crystal's home life had been complicated, the way home lives often are for children in working-class families where money is tight and stability is hard to come by. But Jeannie did her best, and Crystal, despite everything, was a happy child. She had her grandmother, she had her art, she had her dreams. On March 5, 1996, Crystal John Baker was at a convenience store in Texas City. She had been dropped off there to use the payphone to call her mother. It was a routine errand, the kind of thing she had done before. She was supposed to make her call and then wait to be picked up. It should have taken 10 minutes. Crystal was never picked up. When her family came to get her, she was gone. The payphone receiver was hanging off the hook. Crystal's belongings were scattered nearby. There were signs that something had happened quickly, violently, without warning. Someone had taken Crystal from the parking lot of that convenience store, in the middle of the day, and no one had seen a thing. Crystal's body was found the next day, March 6th, under a bridge over the Interstate 45 causeway between Texas City and Galveston. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. She was 13 years old. The murder of Crystal Jean Baker was one of the most devastating individual cases in the Killing Fields story. A 13-year-old girl, taken from a public place in broad daylight, assaulted, and murdered. The community was horrified. The police launched an intensive investigation. Tips poured in. Suspects were identified and investigated, but the case went cold. The killer was not caught, and Crystal's grandmother, Janie Baker, was left to grieve for the child she had raised and loved and lost. Janie Baker did not grieve quietly. Like Tim Miller before her, she channeled her pain into activism. She became a vocal advocate for the Killing Fields victims, attending press conferences, giving interviews, pushing law enforcement to do more. She kept Crystal's memory alive with a fierce, unwavering devotion that was both inspiring and heartbreaking. She refused to let her granddaughter become just another name on a list. She refused to let the world forget. Years passed, decades, and then in 2017, 21 years after Crystal's murder, the case was finally solved. Advances in DNA technology allowed investigators to process evidence from the original crime scene that had been impossible to analyze in 1996. The DNA profile that emerged was run through the national database, and it produced a match. The match led to a man named Kevin Edison Smith. Kevin Edison Smith was a convicted sex offender. At the time of Crystal's murder, he had been living in the Texas City area. He had a history of violent sexual offenses. He was exactly the kind of predator who had thrived along the Interstate 45 corridor, a man with a compulsion toward violence against women, living in an area that provided an abundance of vulnerable targets and a landscape that was ideal for concealing crimes. Smith was arrested and charged with Crystal's murder, but he never stood trial. Before the case could go to court, Kevin Edison Smith died in custody. He was 61 years old. Jeannie Baker received the news of Smith's identification with a mixture of relief and anguish. Relief because she finally knew who had killed her granddaughter. Anguish because the man who had done it would never face a jury, would never be convicted, would never spend a single day in prison for the murder of Crystal Jan Baker. He had escaped earthly justice by the simple act of dying. Crystal's case is a microcosm of the larger Texas killing field story. A young, vulnerable victim, a crime that went unsolved for decades, an investigation that was hampered by limited technology and resources, a breakthrough that came too late for true justice, and a family that was left to live with the aftermath, carrying the weight of their loss for the rest of their lives. But Crystal's case also demonstrates something else, something more hopeful. It demonstrates that the cases are solvable, that the evidence, if it is preserved properly and tested with the right technology, can yield results, that the killers, no matter how long they have been hiding, can be identified. It may take years, it may take decades, but it can be done, and that knowledge, that certainty is what keeps the investigators going. It is what keeps the families hoping, and it is what keeps the Killing Fields cases alive, even now, even after all these years. Let me tell you about one more victim, because her story is essential to understanding the full scope of what happened along the Interstate 45 corridor. Her name was Shelley Sykes. She was a 19-year-old student at the College of the Mainland in Texas City. She was bright, ambitious, and determined to build a better life for herself through education. She worked part-time jobs to pay her tuition. She was the kind of young woman who inspired admiration in the people around her, not because she had been given every advantage, but because she was fighting for every opportunity with determination and grace. On the evening of May 24, 1986, Shelley left a friend's house in Galveston. She was driving home. She never arrived. Her car was found the next day on a road between Gaston and Texas City, parked on the shoulder. The keys were in the ignition. Her purse was on the seat. There was no sign of mechanical trouble, no sign of an accident, no sign of a struggle. It was as if she had simply stopped the car, stepped out, and vanished. The parallels to Jessica Cain's case, which would occur 11 years later, are striking. A young woman driving home at night. A car found abandoned on the shoulder of a road along the Interstate 45 corridor. Personal belongings left behind. No evidence of what had happened. It was as if the same playbook were being used. The same method, the same cold, efficient technique for snatching women from their vehicles and making them disappear. Shelley Sykes' body was found 6 months later, in December of 1986, in a field near Calder Road. She was added to the growing list of victims found in the area around League City. Another young woman whose life had been stolen, and whose death had been concealed in the tall grass and the marshy ground. Shelley's case has never been solved. No one has ever been charged with her murder. Her case file remains open, sitting in a filing cabinet somewhere, waiting for the breakthrough that may or may not come. And Shelley's family, like so many of the Killing Fields families, has been left to carry the weight of that uncertainty for nearly 4 decades. The stories of Hyde and Crystal and Shelley are just 3 among many. There are dozens of others, dozens of women and girls whose names and faces and stories I could tell you, each one as neat and as heartbreaking as the last. But this is not an encyclopedia. It is a story. And what I want you to take away from these individual stories is not the specific details of each case, but the larger pattern they reveal. The pattern is this. The Texas killing fields were not a single event. They were a sustained, decades-long catastrophe. A slow-motion disaster that unfolded over 30 years and claimed the lives of at least 30 women and girls, possibly more. The victims came from different backgrounds and different circumstances, but they shared certain characteristics. They were young, they were female, they were vulnerable, and they lived or traveled along a stretch of highway that had become, without anyone fully realizing it, one of the most dangerous corridors for women in the entire United States. The killers also came from different backgrounds and different circumstances. William Reese was a truck driver from Oklahoma. Kevin Edison Smith was a sex offender from Texas City. Edward Harold Bell was a retired optician with a history of mental illness. Gerald Burr was a police officer. Robert Abel was a retired NASA engineer. Some of these men were convicted. Some were merely suspected. Some confessed. Some denied everything, if the evidence is to be believed. Preyed on the same population of vulnerable women in the same geographic area over the same period of time. This convergence of multiple predators in a single area is not as unusual as it might seem. Criminal behaviorists and profilers have long recognized that certain environments attract certain types of offenders. Areas with high levels of transience, poverty, and social dislocation tend to produce higher rates of violent crime. Areas with fragmented law enforcement and limited surveillance tend to attract predators who know that their chances of being caught are lower. And areas with large populations of vulnerable, marginalized people tend to become hunting grounds for those who prey on the weak and the unprotected. The Interstate 45 corridor had all of these characteristics. It was a perfect storm of risk factors. A place where the conditions for serial violence were not just present, but concentrated. And the result was a body count that is almost unparalleled in American criminal history. The comparison that is most often made is to the Green River Killer case in Washington state, where Gary Ridgway murdered at least 49 women over a 20-year period in the 1980s and 90s. The Green River case is widely considered one of the most prolific serial murder cases in American history. But there is a crucial difference between the Green River case and the Texas killing fields. The Green River case was the work of a single killer. The Texas killing fields were the work of many. And the total number of victims along the Interstate 45 corridor may well exceed the Green River total. This is a staggering thought, that a single 50-mile stretch of highway in southeast Texas may have produced more victims of serial violence than any other comparable area in the country. And yet, the Texas killing fields have never received the same level of national attention as the Green River case, or the Ted Bundy case, or the BTK case, or any of the other high-profile serial murder cases that have captivated the American public. Why? Because the killing fields do not fit the narrative template that the media and the public have come to expect from serial murder cases. There is no single charismatic villain. There is no dramatic arrest. There is no tidy courtroom resolution. There is instead a sprawling, messy, frustratingly complex story that resists simplification and defies the conventions of true crime storytelling. And yet, it is precisely the complexity of the story that makes it so important. Because the Texas killing fields are not an anomaly. They are an extreme example of a pattern that exists in many places across the country. A pattern of serial violence against vulnerable women in areas where the conditions allow predators to operate with relative impunity. The killing fields are a mirror, and what they show us, if we are willing to look, is not a monster lurking in the darkness. It is a system that allows monsters to thrive, a system that underfunds law enforcement in communities that need it most, a system that treats some victims as more important than others, a system that fragments jurisdictions and creates gaps in coverage that predators can exploit, a system that criminalizes poverty and addiction instead of addressing them, pushing vulnerable people further to the margins where they are even more exposed to violence. A system that, in 1,000 small ways, sends the message that some lives are worth protecting and some are not. The Texas killing fields are not just a crime story. They are an indictment. an indictment of the way we treat the most vulnerable members of our society, an indictment of the way we allocate resources and attention, an indictment of the way we define who matters and who does not. And until those systemic failures are addressed, the conditions that produce the killing fields will continue to exist, perhaps not in the same place, perhaps not along the same stretch of highway, but somewhere, in some forgotten corridor, in some overlooked community, in some place where the grass is tall and the ground is soft and the screams go unheard. The pattern will repeat itself, because it always does, because we let it. That is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of the Texas killing fields. It is not just a story about what happened. It is a story about why it was allowed to happen. And the answer to that question, the real answer, is not about one killer or even many killers. It is about us, about the choices we make as a society, about the people we choose to protect and the people we choose to forget. The women and girls of the killing fields were forgotten, not by their families, not by the people who loved them, but by the larger world, the world that had the power to prevent their deaths and chose not to use it. The world that looked at a string of murdered women along a Texas highway and shrugged and changed the channel. I am telling you their stories tonight because they deserve to be remembered. Because every one of them, from Colette Wilson to Crystal Jane Baker, from Laura Smither to Jessica Kane, from Hyde Villarreal Fye to Shelley Sykes, was a human being whose life had value and whose death was a tragedy. Not a statistic, not a case number, not a name on a list. A person, a real, irreplaceable person. And I am telling you their stories because the story is not over. Because there are still cases that are unsolved, still families that are waiting, still questions that need answers. The Texas killing fields may have grown quieter over the years, but the silence is not the same as resolution. The silence is just the sound of waiting. And somewhere, in a filing cabinet in a police station in Galveston County, or in a laboratory where forensic technicians are running DNA samples through genealogical databases, or in the memory of a witness who has not yet come forward, the answers are waiting too. Waiting to be found. Waiting to be spoken. Waiting to bring some measure of peace to the families who have lived without it for far too long. The work is not done. It may never be done. But it continues, and as long as it continues, there is hope. Not the bright, easy hope of certainty, but the quieter, harder hope of persistence. The hope that says we will not give up, we will not forget. We will keep looking, keep testing, keep asking questions, keep demanding answers, until every last secret of the Texas killing fields has been dragged into the light. That is the promise. And for the families of the victims, for the investigators who have devoted their careers to these cases, for the communities that have lived in the shadow of this violence for nearly half a century, that promise is everything. The legacy of the Texas killing fields extends far beyond the criminal cases themselves. It reshaped how law enforcement in Texas, and across the country, approaches serial violence. The failures that allowed the killing fields to fester for decades, the jurisdictional fragmentation, the lack of communication between agencies, the inadequate resources devoted to cases involving marginalized victims, became case studies in what not to do. And from those failures, real change emerged. The multi-agency task forces that were formed in the late 1990s and early 2000s became models for collaborative investigation. Departments that had once jealously guarded their case files began sharing information through centralized databases. The development of VKeep, the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program maintained by the FBI, owed some of its urgency to cases like the killing fields, where the absence of a centralized system had allowed patterns to go undetected for years. Tim Miller's Texas EquuSearch became one of the most respected volunteer search and recovery organizations in the world, assisting in thousands of cases far beyond the Interstate 45 corridor. Born from the grief of a father who lost his daughter in the Calder Road field, the organization transformed that grief into something that has saved lives and brought closure to countless families. Tim Miller took the worst thing that ever happened to him and built something extraordinary from the wreckage. That is not redemption exactly, because nothing can redeem the murder of a child, but it is something close. It is proof that even in the darkest places, the human capacity for love and service can survive. Forensic genealogy. The technology that identified Audrey Lee Cook and Donna Prudhomme after decades of anonymity continues to advance. Cold case units across the country are using these techniques to identify unknown victims and unknown killers from cases that are 10, 30, even 40 years old. The Jane Does of the killing fields, those nameless women who were buried without identity, are slowly, one by one, being given back their names. And with those names come new leads, new connections, new possibilities for justice. The communities along Interstate 45 have changed as well. League City, once a sleepy bedroom community, has grown into a city of more than 100,000 people. The open fields and marshlands that once provided cover for killers have been developed, replaced by neighborhoods and commercial districts. The physical landscape of the killing fields has been transformed, but the memory remains. There is a memorial now, near the area where so many of the victims were found. It is a simple marker, a reminder that this ground holds history, that this place witnessed suffering, that the women and girls who were left here are not forgotten. People visit it. They leave flowers. They stand in silence and think about what happened and what it means. And the investigation continues. Quietly, persistently, without fanfare. Detectives and forensic scientists are still working the cases, still testing evidence, still searching for answers. The killing fields are patient. And so are the people who refuse to let them keep their secrets. If you drive along Interstate 45 today, between Houston and Galveston, you will see a highway that looks like any other highway in America. Strip malls and gas stations and fast food restaurants line the exits. Housing developments stretch out on either side, rows of identical homes with freshly planted trees and two-car garages. The refineries still hum in the distance, their towers rising against the flat Texas sky, trailing plumes of white steam that dissolve into the clouds. Traffic moves in a steady, endless stream. Thousands of people going to work, going home, going about their lives without giving a second thought to the road beneath their tires. It looks ordinary. It looks safe. And maybe now, it is safer than it was. The open fields are smaller. The marshlands have been drained and developed. The isolated stretches of road where a car could pull over unnoticed in the middle of the night are fewer and farther between. The world has changed. Technology has changed. The cameras that watch us everywhere, the phones that track our every movement, the DNA that we shed with every breath and every touch. All of these things have made it harder for predators to operate in the shadows. Not impossible, but harder. And yet, when I think about the Texas killing fields, I do not think about technology or development or the changing landscape. I think about the people. I think about Colette Wilson, 13 years old, walking home from school on a hot June afternoon, carrying her books, not knowing that she would never arrive. I think about Debbie Ackerman and Maria Johnson, 15 years old, best friends, standing on the side of the highway with their thumbs out, trusting the world to take them where they needed to go. I think about Laura Miller, 16, walking to the convenience store, a short trip, a nothing trip, the kind of errand you run without thinking, and never coming back. I think about Laura Smither, 12, lacing up her running shoes on a cool April morning, stepping out the front door into the sunlight, full of energy and grace and the unshakable belief that the world was a good place. I think about Jessica Kane, 17, driving home from dinner with friends, the radio playing, the highway unspooling in front of her, the exit approaching, and then someone in the darkness. I think about Crystal Jen Baker, 13, standing at a payphone in a convenience store parking lot, making a call, hanging up, turning around, and finding the world had become a different place, a terrible place, in the space of a heartbeat. I think about their mothers, their fathers, their grandmothers. I think about Tim Miller, driving the streets of League City for months, looking for Laura, not knowing that she was lying in a field 3 miles from his house. I think about C.H. Kane, Jessica's father, who spent the rest of his life searching and never found his daughter. I think about Janie Baker, Crystal's grandmother, who fought for 21 years to find her granddaughter's killer, and then learned that he had died before he could be punished. I think about the weight of that, The unbearable, crushing, suffocating weight of losing a child and not knowing why. Of losing a child and not knowing who. Of losing a child and being told, year after year, that there are no answers, no leads, no hope. Of waking up every morning and remembering, before you even open your eyes, that your daughter is gone, and that the person who took her is still breathing, still eating breakfast, still watching their life as if nothing happened. That weight does not go away. It does not lighten with time. It does not ease with the turning of the seasons or the passage of the years. It sits on your chest and it stays there, and it becomes part of you, as permanent and as inescapable as your own heartbeat. The families of the Texas killing fields victims have carried that weight for decades. Some of them have carried it to their graves, and those who are still alive carry it still, every day, every hour, every minute. It is the first thing they feel when they wake up and the last thing they feel when they fall asleep. It is the background noise of their existence, a low, constant hum of grief and anger and bewilderment that never fully fades. I cannot take that weight away. Nobody can. But I can do this. I can say their names. I can tell their stories. I can make sure that the world knows they existed, that they mattered, that their deaths were not acceptable, and their lives were not forgettable. I can refuse to let them be reduced to statistics or case numbers or entries in a database. I can insist, as their families have insisted for decades, that they were real people who deserved real justice and real remembrance. Colette Wilson, Brenda Jones, Georgia Geer, Debbie Ackerman, Maria Johnson, Heidva Lyle Fye, Laura Miller, Shelley Sykes, Crystal Jen Baker, Laura Smither, Jessica Kane, Audrey Lee Cook, Donna Prodhomme, and all the others whose names I have not mentioned tonight, whose stories I did not have time to tell, whose faces I did not have space to describe. They are all part of this. They are all remembered. They are all loved by someone, somewhere, who will never stop missing them. The Texas killing fields are quiet now. The tall grass sways in the Gulf breeze. The highway hums. The sky stretches out wide and flat and endless, the way it always has. But the ground remembers, and so do we. Thank you for listening tonight. If this case moved you, leave a comment. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and hold the people you love a little closer tonight. Good night, and stay safe.